Lucas had never thought he would cry in the middle of a street like a child. He was a grown man, 38 years old, with calloused hands and a chest full of quiet endurance. A man who had learned long ago that tears were a luxury he could not afford. And yet, as the old pickup truck rolled slowly down the main road of Maplewood, the familiar scent of pine trees and damp earth flooding through the cracked window, something inside him gave way not all at once, but like a dam that had held too long against a current far too patient to ever stop. The sun was beginning its descent behind the ridge of hills that framed the western edge of town, and the light it left behind was the same amber warmth he remembered from boyhood, the kind that turned even ordinary things, peeling paint on a fence post, laundry on a line, into something worth memorizing. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. He told himself he was ready for this. He was not. 10 years ago, Lucas had left Maplewood with 2 empty hands, a daughter who had just turned 5, and debts that felt like iron chains wrapped around his ankles. Before he left, he had stood on Sarah Calloway's front porch, the porch with the old wooden swing that her grandfather had built, the one that creaked in a particular, almost musical way whenever the wind came through, and he had made her a promise. He had said he would come back when things were better. When he was better, when he had something worth coming home to. Sarah had smiled at him in that quiet way she had, the way that made him feel both steadied and undone at the same time, and she had said 3 words he had carried with him through a decade of hard winters and longer nights. "I will wait." He had told himself she was only being kind. He had been wrong about a great many things in his life. That had been his worst mistake of all. The town of Maplewood, nestled between 2 slow-curving rivers in the rural heartland of Ohio, had the particular quality of places that resist change, not out of stubbornness but out of something gentler, a collective sense that what had been built here was worth preserving. The hardware store on the corner still had the same hand-painted sign it had carried since Lucas was a boy. The diner with the red checkered curtains still put fresh flowers in the window every Monday morning. The elementary school, where Lucas had spent years of unremarkable but secretly cherished afternoons, still had the same rusting basketball hoop in the side yard that nobody had ever gotten around to replacing. These were not the things Lucas had fled from when he left. They were the things he had ached for every single day that he stayed away. He had been 28 years old when his wife, Rachel, died. The illness had come quickly, or at least it had seemed quick, the way catastrophes always seem sudden even when they have been building for a long time in the dark. It had taken 4 months from diagnosis to the end, and in those 4 months, Lucas had watched the woman he had married become something fragile and translucent, like a figure made of paper held up to a window. He had held her hand through every treatment and refused to believe the doctors until there was simply nothing left to refuse. When it was over, he was left alone with Emily, who was only 18 months old at the time, and a hospital bill so large it seemed almost abstract. A number that didn't feel like money but like a sentence, like a verdict handed down by some indifferent authority that had decided his life would be this and nothing easier. By the time Emily was 5, the debts had compounded. The house they had shared, a small white-sided place on the edge of town with a yard barely large enough for a vegetable garden, was deteriorating faster than Lucas could repair it. The gutters leaked. The furnace made sounds like it was attempting conversation with itself in the middle of the night. Lucas worked whatever work he could find, which in Maplewood meant occasional construction, hauling firewood in the autumn months, helping at the grain elevator during harvest season, and doing odd jobs for neighbors who paid in cash, and sometimes in casseroles. It was never quite enough. The month the truck broke down was the same month the property tax notice arrived, and Lucas sat at the kitchen table that night with Emily asleep in the next room, and stared at the papers spread in front of him, and understood that something had to change. Sarah Calloway had lived 3 houses down from Lucas for as long as either of them could remember. They had been in the same class at Maplewood Elementary, had shared the same bus route through middle school, had attended the same church and the same summer picnics, and the same 4th of July celebrations for the entirety of their childhoods. Everyone in town had assumed, at various points over the years, that the 2 of them would end up together. There was a kind of inevitability in the way they occupied the same spaces, the way their conversations had always felt less like exchanges and more like continuations of something already in progress. But Lucas had met Rachel during a summer job in Columbus when he was 19. and that had redirected the course of things, and Sarah had watched from a careful distance and found, over the years, that the distance did not reduce what she felt for him but only seemed to give it more room to grow. After Rachel died, Sarah was there. She brought food without being asked. She sat with Emily on the porch in the evenings when Lucas needed an hour of silence. She noticed when the firewood was running low and arranged for her cousin to deliver more before Lucas had to ask. She helped Emily learn to read, spreading picture books across the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, and pointing at words with a patience that seemed inexhaustible. Emily, in the uncanny way that children cut straight to truth, called her the prettiest Sarah in the whole world. A title Sarah accepted with the kind of laughter that held something tender underneath it. Lucas knew what Sarah felt for him. He had known for years, even before Rachel, even before all of it. He had never found a way to speak about it that did not feel like an intrusion on something she had never officially offered. And in those hard years after Rachel's death, he had told himself it would not be fair not to Sarah. Not when he was so thoroughly broken, so buried in grief and obligation and shame. The night before he left, they sat together on her porch. The air smelled of late summer cut grass and honeysuckle, and the faintest edge of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. The old wooden swing moved in small arcs, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which was one of the things Lucas had always valued most about Sarah. The fact that silence between them had never felt like absence but like a form of company. He told her his plan, which was not much of a plan. He would take Emily to Columbus, where his cousin Danny had a spare room and some contacts in the construction industry. He would work. He would pay off the debts. He would put Emily in a good school and give her what Maplewood, for all its gentleness, could not give her in the shape her life currently occupied. And then he would come back. When things were better, when he was better, Sarah had listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she had looked at him with those gray-green eyes of hers and said, "I will wait." Lucas had told himself she was just being kind. He had packed the truck the next morning while she stood in her doorway watching, Emily asleep against his shoulder, and driven away without looking in the rearview mirror, because he knew if he did he would not be able to keep going. Columbus was not unkind to Lucas, but it was not gentle either. His cousin Danny had a room above a garage that smelled of motor oil and old carpet. And Emily slept on a cot beside the single window, while Lucas worked 12-hour days on whatever construction site would have him. He was not unskilled. He had done enough building and repairing in Maplewood to know his way around a framing crew, and within 6 months, he had steadied himself into a reliable position with a mid-sized contractor named Holt Brothers, pouring concrete and raising walls, and learning the precise, disciplined grammar of physical labor that asks nothing of a man's interior life, and pays him back in exhaustion clean enough to sleep on. It was not the worst thing, in those early years, to be so tired that thinking became impossible. Emily started kindergarten in a school that was larger and louder than anything Maplewood could have offered, and she adapted with the resilience of children who have already learned that the world is not always arranged for their comfort. She was quiet and observant and made friends slowly and carefully, choosing them the way her father chose lumber for their straightness, their lack of obvious defects. She did not talk much about her mother, though sometimes Lucas would find her looking at the photograph he kept on the shelf above the kitchen sink. Rachel, in her early 20s, squinting into summer sunlight, laughing at something just outside the frame, and Emily's expression in those moments was not quite grief and not quite longing, but something that contained both and had not yet found a name for itself. Lucas lost his phone during the second year when someone took it from his jacket on a job site, and he did not replace it immediately because money was still tight, and he told himself he would get a new one when the next paycheck cleared, and then the paycheck went to Emily's school fees, and the month after that, to a broken radiator. And by the time he had a working number again, the landscape of his connections had shifted. He changed addresses twice, once when Danny's landlord raised the rent beyond what was reasonable, and once when Lucas managed to secure a small apartment of his own, in a part of the city that was not beautiful but was decent, and within walking distance of Emily's school. Sarah's letters, which had arrived at the first address with a regularity that spoke of genuine intention, stopped reaching him. He did not know for years that she had kept writing. He would not learn until much later that the post office had returned several envelopes to her stamped with bureaucratic indifference, and that she had kept every one of them in a shoebox on her closet shelf, the stamps still uncancelled, the words still inside, waiting for an address she didn't have. There were nights more than Lucas cared to count when he bought a bus ticket back to Maplewood. He would hold the ticket in his hand at the station, watching the departure board, and then something would stop him. Sometimes it was practical. A shift he couldn't miss. A debt payment that couldn't wait. Sometimes it was something harder to name, a feeling that sat in his chest like cold stone, and told him he had not yet earned the right to return. He had made a promise to himself alongside the promise he had made to Sarah, and his version of that promise was that he would not walk back into her life until he was no longer the same man who had walked out of it, until he had reduced the weight he carried to something a person could reasonably stand. Beside, the pride of the broken is a strange and stubborn thing, and it kept him away longer than any debt or distance ever could. Emily turned 10, then 12, then 15. She grew into a young woman with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet deliberateness, a girl who read constantly and argued thoughtfully and had a particular gift for mathematics that her teachers noted with the kind of enthusiasm that implied futures more expansive than the ones Lucas had been able to imagine for himself. At Hare, he went to every parent-teacher conference. He attended every school play and every science fair and every awkward middle school graduation ceremony where the children looked simultaneously bored and terrified. He made her breakfast every morning and dinner every evening, and on weekends they sometimes drove to the park and sat by the river, and Lucas would listen while Emily talked about whatever occupied her mind. That week a book she was reading, a problem she was working through, a question about the world that she had not yet found a satisfying answer to. It was not the life he had planned. It was better in some ways and worse in others. And he held on to the better parts with both hands. Back in Maplewood, the seasons turned and returned, and Sarah Calloway's life arranged itself around the hollow space that Lucas's absence had left in it. She finished her education degree and came back to teach second grade at the same elementary school she and Lucas had attended as children. A symmetry that pleased her, even as it reminded her, every morning when she walked through those doors, of all the mornings that had passed. She was good at her work, patient and inventive, and genuinely curious about the small, serious minds in her classroom, and the children loved her with the uncomplicated directness that makes teaching both exhausting and irreplaceable. Her colleagues respected her. The parents of her students brought her baked goods and handwritten notes, and occasionally, awkwardly, mentioned cousins or brothers or neighbors who were single and kind. She always thanked them and meant it and did not pursue it. The men who expressed interest in Sarah Calloway over those 10 years were not, by any reasonable measure, unworthy of her attention. There was Richard Gould, who owned the farm supply store on the north edge of town and brought her sunflowers, and spoke of his children from a previous marriage with a warmth that she found genuinely moving. There was Dr. James Whitfield, who had joined the county medical practice and was thoughtful and well-traveled and laughed easily at his own expense. There was even Martin Hess, the county sheriff, a widower of steady demeanor and quiet generosity, who had made his feelings known over the course of 2 careful years before finally accepting, with grace, that they would not be returned. Sarah liked all of these men. She could see, in each of them, the shape of a life that would have been good, not perfect, but good in the ways that matter. She chose none of them. When pressed, when her mother sat across from her at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and asked, with the gentle directness of a woman who had watched her daughter carry something heavy for a very long time, how long she intended to keep waiting, Sarah had thought about it for a moment, and then said, "Until my heart stops calling his name." It was not a dramatic declaration. She said it quietly, in the same tone she might have used to answer any ordinary question. And that quietness was what made it final. Every afternoon, after her classroom was tidied and her lesson plans for the next day were arranged on her desk, Sarah walked the 6 blocks from the school to her house and sat on the front porch in the wooden swing her grandfather had built. She sat there through spring rains and summer heat and autumn winds and the brittle cold of January, wrapped in a quilt on the worst days, sometimes with a book in her lap and sometimes with nothing at all, looking out at the long curve of the road that led into town. She did not think of it as waiting. Exactly, or she had stopped thinking of it in those terms sometime around the 4th or 5th year, when waiting had become simply a part of how she occupied the world, as natural and unexamined as breathing. She had loved Lucas Hale since she was 11 years old, and that love had not diminished with distance or silence or the pragmatic counsel of well-meaning friends. It had simply persisted, the way certain things persist, the way the river persists in its bed, the way the hills persist against the sky, indifferent to any individual season. Lucas Hale turned 38 in February, and in March of that same year he paid the last installment on the hospital debt that had been attached to him for a decade like a second shadow. He sat in his car in the parking lot of the bank after making the payment and did not move for a long time. The sensation was not quite relief and not quite happiness, but something more disorienting, the sudden absence of a weight so familiar that its removal felt less like freedom than like the strange lightness of a missing limb. He drove home slowly and sat at the kitchen table in the apartment he had occupied for 4 years, and for the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to think about Maplewood without the accompanying guilt that had always followed that thought like a second thought designed to shut it down. Emily was home that evening, sorting through old boxes from the closet she had finally gotten around to cleaning. And Lucas was in the kitchen heating soup when he heard her go quiet in the next room. He was accustomed to Emily's silences. She had inherited his habit of going still when something required her full attention, and so he did not immediately investigate. But when several minutes passed, and she remained quiet, he set down the ladle and went to the doorway, and found her sitting cross-legged on the floor of her room with a small wooden box open on her knee. She looked up at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something complex and careful, and very nearly stern. Inside the box were things he had not looked at in years. A photograph of Sarah, taken on a summer afternoon, her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression caught between laughter and something more serious. A handmade card Emily had given her the last Christmas they had all been in Maplewood together. And 3 letters Lucas had started writing to Sarah over the years, and never finished, and never sent, folded small and tucked beneath everything else, like something he had not entirely been able to put away. Emily looked at the letters and then at her father, and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, with the particular directness of a 15-year-old who has decided that something important needs to be said clearly, "You never forgot her." It was not a question. Lucas sat down on the edge of her bed and looked at the photograph in his daughter's hands and told her the truth, which was that no, he had never forgotten. He told her about Sarah's patience and her kindness and the 3 words she had said on the porch the night before they left. He told her about the bus tickets he had bought and not used, about the letters he had started and not finished, about the pride and the shame and the stubborn, misdirected idea that he needed to be fixed before he deserved to be seen. Emily listened to all of it, with the focused attention she brought to everything, and when he finished, she closed the box gently and set it on the floor beside her and said, "You spent 10 years giving everything to me. That's the only reason we're still standing. But Dad, you can't spend the next 10 years giving nothing to yourself." She paused. "Go back. If she's still there, go back." Lucas looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he nodded. He bought the bus ticket the following morning. For the first time in a decade, he did not cancel it. The ride from Columbus to Maplewood took just under 3 hours, and Lucas spent most of it looking out the window at the landscape that had shaped him, the flat miles of farmland giving way gradually to the more rolling terrain of the eastern county, the familiar water tower of Millburg appearing on the horizon like a landmark he had been navigating toward without knowing it. He had a bag packed with enough for a week. He had no plan beyond arriving. He had not called ahead because he did not know what he would say, and because some part of him understood that what was needed here was not words arranged carefully in advance, but simply the act of showing up, or of being present in the place where he should have been all along. The bus let him off at the depot on Crane Street, which was exactly as he remembered it, except that the bench outside had been replaced, and the old hand-lettered schedule board had given way to a digital display that seemed aggressively modern against the backdrop of the town's general refusal of change. Lucas stood on the sidewalk with his bag over his shoulder and let Maplewood settle around him. The air was different here from the city, quieter in the way that places without traffic are quiet, and full of particular smells, cut grass and river mud, and the faintly sweet drift from the bakery on Morrison Avenue. He walked slowly. He was in no hurry now. He had been in a hurry for 10 years, and look where that had gotten him. He passed Morrison's bakery, where Mrs. Morrison herself was visible through the glass, arranging something in the display case with the focused care she had always brought to that task. He passed the hardware store, where he had once bought his first set of tools at the age of 17, proud of the purchase in a way that now seemed touching, almost heartbreaking. He passed the elementary school, empty at this hour, the rusting basketball hoop still presiding over the empty side yard, like a small monument to institutional inertia. He passed the church where Rachel's funeral had been held, and he did not look away from it this time. He looked at it directly, let the memory move through him, and kept walking. He passed the park where Emily had learned to ride a bicycle on a September afternoon, crying and laughing alternately until she got it, and then riding in larger and larger circles until the light failed. He walked on. He turned onto Birchwood Lane, which was the street he had grown up on, where the houses sat back from the road behind old maple trees that had continued their slow expansion through every year of his absence, and whose shade now fell across the sidewalk in patterns that felt like a kind of welcome. Sarah Calloway's house was the third from the corner. It was painted the same color. It had always been a soft cream with green shutters, and the garden along the front walk was tidy and full of the late afternoon color that comes from the particular combination of plants that someone has chosen with care over many years. The porch ran across the front of the house, and on the porch was the old wooden swing that her grandfather had built, and in the swing sat a woman with light brown hair and a book open in her lap, angled slightly toward the fading sun, in the particular posture of someone who has been sitting in this spot so long that the seat has shaped itself to accommodate them. Lucas stopped on the sidewalk. He did not move. The world around him seemed to pause, the slight wind stilling, the birdsong going briefly silent, the last light of the afternoon holding itself at a particular angle, as if it, too, were waiting to see what would happen next. He stood there and looked at Sarah Calloway, who had not yet looked up, and he felt something move through him that was so large and so long suppressed that it came out wrong. At first came out as a sharp intake of breath, a sudden burning behind his eyes, a trembling in the muscles of his jaw that he could not control. 10 years. He had been 10 years away from this porch and this woman and this particular quality of late afternoon light. And he stood on the sidewalk and felt the full weight of that time descend on him all at once. Felt it the way you feel a cold wind, not gradually but entirely, all at once, as if it had been waiting for the exact moment of stillness to arrive. Sarah looked up. It was the stillness that caught her attention. He would learn later she had a teacher's trained peripheral awareness, an instinct for the presence of something that did not belong to the ordinary pattern of the afternoon. She looked up from her book and turned toward the sidewalk. And her eyes found him. And for one long suspended moment, neither of them moved or spoke. Lucas watched her face as recognition came, watched it move through her like a tide, starting somewhere beneath her expression and rising until it reached the surface and rearranged everything. She set the book down on the seat beside her. She stood. The swing rocked gently in her wake. She came to the edge of the porch steps and stood there, and her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper, rough with something she was working to contain. "Lucas?" He could not answer. He tried and found that whatever words he had arranged in his mind over the 3-hour ride had dissolved completely. What came instead was the thing he had told himself he was too old and too weathered to do. He came through the garden gate and up the porch steps, and his legs gave way somewhere near the top, and he knelt there on the worn boards of Sarah Calloway's porch and pressed his face into his hands and wept. He wept the way people weep when they have been strong for a very long time and have finally arrived at the place where they are allowed to be something else. Sarah came down from the top step and sat beside him on the porch and put her arms around his shoulders. And she held on. And she did not try to stop him or tell him it was all right, because she understood that sometimes what a person needs is not reassurance, but simply the company of someone willing to witness the breaking. She held him there on the porch in the last of the afternoon light, and after a while, the sound of his crying eased, and they sat together in the particular silence that follows long emotion, not empty silence, but full silence, the kind that carries everything that has just been said without words. They sat in the swing for a long time that evening. The neighborhood went quiet around them, the children called in for dinner, the traffic on the main road falling off as the hour grew late, the porch light coming on automatically overhead. Lucas talked. He had not meant to talk so much, but once he started, he found it difficult to stop. As though he had been saving things up for a decade, and the dam he had built to contain them was no longer functional. He told her about the early years in Columbus Danny's garage room, the construction sites, the cold mornings, the particular desolation of eating dinner alone in a small apartment, while Emily slept and the city hummed outside the window, indifferent and continuous. He told her about the bus tickets. He told her about the letters he had started and never finished. He told her about the shame, the specific, complicated shame of a man who believes he is not enough, and who allows that belief to make him into the very thing he is afraid of being. He told her that there had not been a single day in 10 years when he had not thought about her, not one. Sarah listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she told him her version. She told him about the letters she had sent to the first address Danny had given her, and about the ones that came back. She told him about the men who had tried to court her, she said it simply, without drama, because it was simply the truth, and about why she had said no to all of them. She said, "It wasn't that I thought you were coming back tomorrow. I knew it might be years. I think some part of me even knew it might be never, but I also knew that saying yes to someone else would have required me to mean it, and I couldn't mean it. Not while I still felt this." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out something small, a woven bracelet, worn thin with time, the colors faded but the pattern still legible. She held it out to him, and he recognized it immediately. He had given it to her the summer they were 17, bought from a vendor at the county fair, a gesture so small at the time that he had been embarrassed to make it. She had kept it for 20 years. He held it in his palm and could not speak. Then Sarah went inside and came back with a shoebox, and she set it on her knee and opened it. And inside were things he had never expected to see again. A photograph taken at that same county fair, the two of them squinting into summer sunlight. A stub from a movie ticket they had shared at 14, a small folded note he had left in her locker the day before summer break, when they were 12, which said, "Only have a good summer, Lucas H." She had kept all of it. She had kept all of it. And she had sat on this porch every afternoon for 10 years looking at the road that led into town. And she had waited with the kind of patience that does not announce itself because it does not think of itself as patience, but only as love continuing past the point where it was convenient. The day Emily arrived in Maplewood, 3 weeks after her father, she came on the train rather than the bus. She had always preferred trains, having developed a romantic attachment to them from a book she had read at the age of 10. And Lucas met her at the small station, on the east side of town, with Sarah standing a careful half-step behind him, close enough to be present, but far enough to leave room for whatever Emily needed to feel first. Emily was 15 years old, tall and dark-eyed and serious in the way of people who have spent a long time paying close attention to things, and she stepped off the train and looked at her father, and then at the woman beside him, and did not say anything for a moment. Lucas had told her about Sarah on the phone, had told her everything, the whole story from the beginning, and Emily had listened and asked a few precise questions, and then said she would come and see for herself. She had her mother's pragmatism in her. That girl, Sarah, did not try to be anything Emily had not asked her to be. She did not lean in or overextend, did not offer affection that had not been requested, did not attempt to fill any space that was not hers to fill. She simply introduced herself, shook Emily's hand, which made Emily smile in spite of herself, and said she was glad to finally meet her, because she had heard a great deal about her over the years, which was true. She had heard about Emily from Lucas in the weeks since his return, but she had also heard about her in other ways, from the stories Lucas had told before he left, from the imagined version of the girl she had constructed over the intervening years, based on the small facts she had available. To finally see the real Emily, opinionated and careful and unmistakably, her father's daughter, was its own particular satisfaction. They went to dinner at the diner, with the red-checkered curtains, and Sarah asked Emily about her interests, and listened with the focused attention of a teacher, who was also genuinely curious, and Emily answered her questions with the measured candor of someone who has decided to reserve full judgment while remaining open to revision. The moment that mattered happened 2 days later. When Emily and Sarah were sitting on the porch after Lucas had gone inside to make coffee, Emily looked at the old swing, and then at Sarah, and said, "You really waited 10 years." She said it without accusation, but with genuine curiosity, the kind of question a person asks when they cannot quite construct the inner life that would make an action make sense to them. Sarah considered the question seriously, and then said, "I didn't think of it as waiting. I just couldn't imagine feeling this way about someone else. The time passed, I had my work and my life, and my friends, but the feeling didn't change, and I didn't want to build something on top of a feeling I didn't mean." Emily was quiet for a moment and then said, "Did you ever think he wasn't coming back?" Sarah said, very honestly, "Yes. Often." Emily nodded slowly. She looked out at the road, the way her father had looked at it from the sidewalk 3 weeks ago, with the recognition of someone seeing, for the first time, what another person had been looking at for a very long time. Then her eyes grew bright, and she pressed her lips together and turned away briefly, and when she turned back, she was composed again, the way she always was. But Sarah had seen it, and it was enough. The news that Lucas Hale had returned to Maplewood spread through the town in the way that news spreads in small towns, not through any single announcement but through a dozen overlapping conversations, each one adding a detail or an emphasis, until within a week, the whole of it was common knowledge, with varying degrees of accuracy. Gina Marsh at the diner had seen him walk past the window on the first afternoon, and had told the couple at table 4, who told the hardware store owner when they stopped in the next morning, and by the following Sunday, it had reached the church congregation in the form of a poorly concealed whisper exchange during the second hymn. Most people were simply glad. A few were surprised in the specific way of people who had formed opinions about the situation that the situation had now chosen to contradict. These were primarily the people who had told Sarah, at various points over the years, and always with the certainty of those who feel they are being helpful, that Lucas was not coming back, that she was wasting the best years of her life, that love like that belonged in novels and not in actual Ohio towns, where actual people had actual practical needs that could be met by actual available men. Mrs. Pearson from the library, who had been among the more persistent voices in this chorus, crossed the street when she saw Lucas and Sarah walking together, and then thought better of it, and crossed back and shook his hand and said she was glad to see him. It was the most graceful thing she could have done, and Sarah later told Lucas this, and he laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she had not heard from him in a very long time, and had wondered sometimes if she would ever hear again. The house that Lucas had grown up in, 3 doors down from Sarah's, had been sold twice over the intervening years, and was now owned by an older couple who had been quietly considering a move to be nearer their grandchildren. Lucas approached them with what he hoped was a reasonable offer, and was surprised to find that they were not only willing to sell, but seemed genuinely pleased that the house would go back to someone who knew its history. He signed the papers in late spring, and spent the early summer doing the work himself, replacing the gutters that had been replaced poorly, resurfacing the floors, repainting the exterior in the same soft gray it had been when he was young. Sarah came over on weekends and helped with the smaller tasks, and they worked together in a companionable silence that felt, to both of them, like the resumption of something that had only been interrupted and never truly stopped. The porch swing from Sarah's house stayed where it was, but Lucas built a new one for his own front porch, built it himself from white oak, using plans he found and adapted and improved over several evenings at the kitchen table, Emily passing through occasionally to offer opinions on the joinery that she had no particular expertise in but delivered with great confidence. And when he set it in place and hung it from the porch ceiling, it made When the wind moved it, a sound very close to the sound of Sarah's grandfather's swing, that particular low creak that was less like a complaint and more like a voice saying something it had said so many times it no longer needed to be translated. Sarah came over the evening he finished it and sat in it for a long time without speaking, and that silence was its own kind of answer to something neither of them had put into words. One evening in late September, when the air had taken on the early chill that in Maplewood meant summer was genuinely over, and not merely resting, Lucas led Sarah across the yard to his new porch and asked her to sit with him. She sat in the swing, and he sat beside her, and for a few minutes they let the evening settle around them, the sound of crickets from the field behind the house, the far-off sound of a train on the county line, the soft percussion of the swing's movement. Then Lucas turned to her and took both of her hands in his and looked at her with the expression she had learned, over the summer, to recognize as his most serious the expression he wore when he meant something fully, and did not want it mistaken for anything partial. He said, "I know I came back 10 years too late. I know there's no way to give you back the time, and I'm not going to ask you to pretend that any of that was all right, because it wasn't, but I'm here now, and I intend to stay, and if you'll let me, if you'll give me the chance, I want to spend whatever years I have left being the person you should have had all along." He paused. He had meant to say more, but found, in the end, that this was all of it. He said, "Will you marry me?" Sarah Calloway, who had waited 10 years on a porch for a question that had never stopped being worth waiting for, looked at the man she had loved since she was 11 years old and said yes, in the same quiet voice she had used to say, "I will wait." The voice that meant she meant it all the way through to the bone. The wedding took place on a Saturday in May, in the backyard of Lucas's renovated house, which Sarah had helped him plant with the flowers she had been growing in pots on her own porch for the previous 2 springs, transplanted whole and thriving into new soil. It was not a large ceremony. The guest list was made up of neighbors and colleagues, and the handful of old friends who had stayed within range over the years, but it was full in the way that small, intentional things are full. The minister who officiated had baptized Lucas as a child, and buried his wife, and was now, with evident satisfaction, marrying him, a sequence that he mentioned in his brief remarks, with the gentle humor of someone who has witnessed enough of a life to find it genuinely interesting. Emily stood beside her father in a dress the color of pale gold, and when the time came for the exchange of rings, she produced hers from a small cloth bag that she held with both hands, with the careful dignity of a young woman who understands that what she is holding belongs to a moment that will not come again. She was 16 by then, and she had spent the year in Maplewood, enrolled at the county high school, and she had discovered with a surprise that moved slowly towards something closer to gratitude, that what she had been afraid of losing in coming here, the particular identity of a girl whose father belonged entirely to her, had not been lost at all, but only expanded. Sarah had not tried to replace anyone. She had simply added herself, carefully, to the space that was available, and the space that was available had turned out to be larger than Emily had expected. The moment in the ceremony that no one who was present would forget came after the vows, when Emily stepped forward to hand Lucas the ring. She held it out, and then held his hand for a moment longer than the gesture required a beat too long, just slightly, the way a person holds a door, not because they have forgotten to let go, but because letting go requires a small act of will, and she looked at Sarah and said, quietly enough, that only the 3 of them, and perhaps the minister, could hear, "I think my mom would have been happy about this." She always knew how to recognize a person worth trusting. "I think she would have trusted you." Sarah took the ring from Emily's hand and held it for a moment before Lucas placed it on her finger, and neither of them was entirely steady, and that was all right. Some of the guests looked away out of a kind of respect, the instinct people have in the presence of grief and joy arriving together, which is the most human of all arrivals. Years passed. The particular speed of years in a place that resists time, not slowly, not quickly, but in the way that contented time moves, which is to say it moves with the rhythm of the people living it rather than against them. Emily went to a university in Cleveland and studied environmental engineering, and came home every Thanksgiving and Christmas and several weekends in between, and in her 3rd year She brought home a young man named Daniel, who was quiet and earnest and very clearly devoted to her, and Lucas sat across from him at the dinner table and thought about what it meant to be on this side of the table now, the side of observation rather than the side of being observed, and found that it suited him in unexpected ways. Sarah continued teaching second grade, year after year producing small readers and careful thinkers who would go on to carry some fragment of her patient attention with them into their adult lives without knowing where it came from, the way we all carry things we were given before we were old enough to note the giving. Lucas found work with a local contractor and later went into business for himself. A small operation that handled residential renovation and repair, the kind of careful, unhurried work that suited a man who had learned the value of doing things right rather than doing them fast. On the porch of the house on Birchwood Lane, the white oak swing moved in the late afternoon breeze of what would come to be one of many hundreds of such afternoons, Lucas and Sarah side by side, her feet tucked up under her as she read, his hand resting on the armrest beside hers in the uncalculated proximity of people who have been in the same space long enough that closeness no longer requires intention. In the yard, if you happened to be walking by on the right autumn afternoon, you might see the small shapes of Emily's children, two of them by the third year of her marriage, a boy and a girl running through the leaves that the old maple at the edge of the property dropped every October in great red and golden quantities, the same maple that had been dropping its leaves in this yard since before Lucas was born. The children shrieked and laughed in the way children shriek and laugh when everything is exactly as it should be. The old swing creaked its low, familiar note in the wind. Lucas looked at Sarah, and Sarah looked at Lucas, and there was no word for what passed between them in that look, because it was not a thing that had ever required language. It had simply always been there, patient and present, the way the river is there, the way the hills are there, the way love is there when it is true enough to outlast everything that tries to be true instead of it. There are promises that are kept easily, quickly, in the space of an afternoon or a year, and there are promises that require a decade and humility and the willingness to arrive late and still believe that late is not the same as never. There are people who wait not out of passivity or fear but out of the specific, difficult courage of knowing your own heart well enough to trust it past the point where trusting feels reasonable. And there are moments, small, unheroic, set on the front porch of an ordinary house, in an ordinary town when all of that resolves at last, and the long arc of what has been waiting to be completed finds its end, and what is left is not the dramatic thing, but the quiet thing. Two people on a swing, in the last light of an afternoon, home.